Session discusses an ecologically sound future. Which way forward? The speakers discuss their different viewpoints about the future of our world. Shekhar Pathak and Ullas Karanth will be in conversation with Mahesh Rangarajan. Mahesh Rangarajan is the author of 3 books: Fencing the Forest, India's Wildlife History and Nature and Nation. He has worked as assistant editor with the Telegraph, Kolkata, and has been a commentator on current affairs with the audiovisual media in both English and Hindi. Shekhar Pathak is a Himalayan traveler and historian. He has published a number of books, research papers, and popular articles. His recent work includes the Chipko movement, a people's history based on his Hindi book Hari Bari Umeed, the essay collection of Mata Himalaya, Pita Himalaya, and the soon-to-be completed The Idea of Opening of Himalaya. And Ullas Karanth, a very well-known face and name in Karnataka. He's a conservation zoologist and a leading tiger expert right here in Karnataka. He's notable for pioneering the scientific use of camera traps in population density studies of large wild mammals in India. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome our speakers for our next session. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a great privilege to be here today. Professor Shekhar Pathak has come from the furthest distance. He's from Uttarakhand. He's a very distinguished professor at Kumaon University, done a remarkable book. He'll be honored later today. He's won the New India Foundation Award for the best non-fiction author of the year. And the book is People's History of the Chipko Movement. I hope you'll all join me in giving him a big hand. Not only for the award, but because he has, over the last 40 years, in fact longer, almost half a century, first been an activist, then been a historian, a chronicler, a writer, and a very rare scholar who has very deep organic roots in the society he writes about. Shekhar in the 70s did something which he's done 5 times. He's gone from the borders of Himachal, Askot, to the borders with Nepal, Arakot, which is several hundred kilometers, on a Padyatra, and in each of them, he's kept a diary, and that itself is a remarkable instance of someone who deeply is rooted in that society, which has been so important for all of us because of the Chipko movement and its legacy. So very warm welcome to you. Aapka swagat hai. Dr. Ullas Karanth doesn't need an introduction anywhere on the planet, and certainly not in Bangalore. But it's a privilege to have him here because he also has given us a new book this month, Among Tigers, which looks at the fight to save the greatest of the great cats. It's not only a story of the tiger, its biology, its conservation, the road ahead. It's also a story, a remarkable one, of his own life. And for those of you who haven't seen the book, one of the remarkable things about the book is the kind of raconteur he is. There are incidents from 1973, 1983, 1967. When you read the book, you feel you're there. And he's reproduced it with some marvelous black and white photographs. Today's issue, of course, is the larger ecological, environmental danger and the road ahead. How does one think about the future? What better people to have than gentlemen who've been distinguished both in the world of action and the world of ideas. So I'll begin by putting this question to both of you. When you look at the road ahead, you, in both your respective works, have some room for optimism. What is the basis of that optimism, and would you like to share it with us?
I think the optimism has to be not wild-eyed optimism. It has to be based on reason and logic. So my optimism is based on reason and logic. There is 2 ways of looking. My focus is on conservation, not broader issues, nature conservation, not broader issues of environmental pollution and all these other things which are basically about making the world a better place for human beings. I'm not saying it's not important, but that doesn't interest me so much. What interests me is the intact natural systems from which we evolved are being destroyed at an alarming rate. And if Mahesh was there 50 years ago and I was here, if he had asked me, I would have been completely pessimistic. In the 1970s, if this question had been asked to me, I would have been totally pessimistic and there's no hope for nature in India. I hold a very different view now, and this view is driven by 2 things. One is data, one is my kind of empirical experience, which I'll capture with the landscape that I know best. This is the Malenad landscape in Karnataka, which today harbors the largest wild tiger population in the whole world. It had less than 70 tigers in in the late 60s. It had half as many people, or perhaps 1/3 as many people, and the average wage of a man was 2.5 rupees. Now the average wage is 600 rupees. There are 3 times as many people, and a lot of growth, economic growth is there as a consequence of an economic growth. So obviously there are lessons here. I can't get into the details here. Obviously, if this is possible, I'm more optimistic at 74 than I was at 19. We are doing some things right, and I think there are approaches to the problem which have to be pragmatic, account for the fact that the world will have 10 billion people, India will have 1.5 billion people, and everybody is voting and have aspirations for material improvement. If conservationists ignore that, we're not going to get there. The question is, how do you meet this and yet rise the proportion of protected wildlife areas in India, which is 4% of the land now, to at least 10%? I think it's doable.
जरा हिंदुस्तानी में बोलने की इजाज़त दीजिएगा। मेरा ये सोचना है कि उम्मीद में दुनिया जीती है, और पूरी ह्यूमन हिस्ट्री में many times जो है we had sad times, sad kind of experiences, ecologically too. और आज भी मुझे उम्मीद है इतनी दुर्दशा के बीच में हमारे समाज, हमारे सामाजिक आंदोलन, they will create new kind of awareness. मैं शुरू में ये मानता रहा हूँ कि इन्हें अनसस्टेनेबल पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी नेवर ड्रीम अबाउट सस्टेनेबल वे ऑफ डेवलपमेंट। अगर अनसस्टेनेबल पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी को आप डेवलप करोगे तो निश्चित रूप से कभी भी सस्टेनेबल डेवलपमेंट नहीं होगा और कभी भी इकोलॉजी नहीं बदलेगी। इसको मानते हुए भी मैं ये मानता हूँ कि सोशल मूवमेंट्स आते हैं, समाज उनको साथ देता है, और वो फिर सरकारों को, कॉरपोरेट्स को और पूरी दुनिया को बिगाड़ने वालों को दबाव में बदलने को विवश करते हैं। वो मेरी उम्मीद है। और आज की दुनिया बहुत छोटी हो गई है, और इस छोटी दुनिया में हम ये जानने लगे हैं, इफ़ यू डिस्ट्रॉय अमेजन फॉरेस्ट it will impact the behavior of Indian monsoon. If you do so much, produce so much black carbon in North India, it will impact the ecology of Iceland and melt faster the ice behind Iceland. तो छोटी सी दुनिया है, और दुनिया में कहीं भी गड़बड़ होगी तो वह दूसरी जगह इम्पैक्ट करेगी. If we destroy Himalaya, the whole northern India will experience the consequences of destruction in the Himalaya. आप देख रहे हैं कि वेस्टर्न घाट को डिस्ट्रॉय कर रहे हैं, और बार बार आपने देखा होगा कि 19 में और 20 में व्हाट काइंड ऑफ फ्लड्स वी हैड इन केरला. तो ये जो कनेक्शन है इसको हमारा समाज समझेगा, ये उम्मीद मेरी है. लेकिन अभी जहाँ पर हम डेवलपमेंट के प्रोसेस में जहाँ पर पहुँचे हैं वो बहुत डिफ़िकल्ट है. उससे अगर विड्रॉ नहीं करेंगे, पीछे नहीं आएंगे तो बहुत मुश्किल होगा. नेचर को ख़त्म करेंगे तो फिर जो सेपियंस है उनके लिए it will be very difficult to save themselves.
So I'm going to ask you a follow-up. One of the points you made is how we cannot look at environment in isolation. There is awakening in different parts of the world because our actions in one place affect actions everywhere. All things are interconnected. But I'm very struck when I look at your work that आपके लेख में एक साज है, एक अंदाज है. आप केवल एक जगह की इतिहास को की रचना नहीं कर रहे हैं, वहाँ के लोग जो हैं उनकी कल्पना क्या थी, कामनाएं क्या थी, उसका भी वर्णन कर रहे हैं. So you know your writings are not just about the movement and the place. You seem to engage with the aspirations of people, their struggles in a certain way. And how did your early life as a member, as someone active in the movement, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, you were among the people protesting the forest auction. Today you're looking back at the impact of such movements. So how did the kind of life you led bring you in touch with these things that you brought ecology and people together?
मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि हाँ, कोई स्कॉलर हो कि ऑर्डिनरी सिटीजन हो, वो एक डेवलपमेंट की प्रोसेस से अवेयरनेस की विकास के साथ आगे बढ़ता है. हम लोग जब स्टूडेंट थे तो पहली बार हमारे समाज ने अपने जंगलों को बचाने के लिए प्रोटेस्ट की, और वो प्रोटेस्ट जो हिमालय में हुई थी वो धीरे धीरे पूरे देश की बन गई, और अवेयरनेस के लिहाज से एक ग्लोबल फेनोमेना वो बन गई. लेकिन हमारे अपने आवर ओन प्रॉब्लम्स रिलेटेड विद प्रॉब्लम विद द फॉरेस्ट्री एंड बायोडाइवर्सिटी, दे वर नॉट सॉल्व्ड येट. धीरे धीरे कंजर्वेशन के एक्ट आए, धीरे धीरे नेशनल पार्क बनने लगे. वी हैव मच मोर स्पेस और द जंगल्स और द टेरिटरी अंडर वाइल्ड लाइफ सेंचुरीज और द नेशनल पार्क्स और बायोडाइवर्सिटी रिजर्व. बट स्टिल वी आर not able to save human lives from the wildlife. The human life-wildlife conflict is very much in our part of Himalaya. People know that we have eaten out the things which were meant for the tiger in the forests. Now tiger is encroaching, especially the leopards in the Himalaya. They are encroaching into the village territory. अब हम बाघ से लेपर्ड से ये तो नहीं कह सकते हैं कि हे बाघ तुम शाकाहारी हो जाओ. उसको तो वही फूड चाहिए जो इतनी शताब्दियों से और इतने इवोल्यूशन के दौर में उसने खाना शुरू किया है. तो कैसे हम ये विकल्प सोचें कि हाउ वी कैन डेवलप द फूड फॉर द वाइल्ड लाइफ in the forest areas, in the wilderness, in the biodiversity areas. तो अब 74 में जिस तरीके से हम फॉरेस्ट के समस्या को समझने लगे थे, आज उसको बड़े लेवल पर हम समझ रहे हैं. उसका जो ग्लोबल कॉन्टेक्स्ट है उसको हम समझ रहे हैं. आज इकोलॉजिकल चेंजेस के संदर्भ में, क्लाइमेट चेंजेस के संदर्भ में वी आर रियलाइजिंग दैट अगर जरा सी भी टेम्परेचर इस प्लेनेट का बढ़ता है तो बहुत मुश्किलें हो जाएंगी. और अगर हिमालय के जंगल करते हैं या कहीं के भी जंगल करते हैं तो कार्बन सिंक के लिए कोई प्लानिंग कमीशन या कोई वर्ल्ड बैंक या कोई यूएनओ कोई एक जगह नहीं बना सकता है. नेचर की ही बनाई हुई जगह में कार्बन को सिंक होना होगा. ये विजडम 74 में नहीं आ सकती थी, लेकिन वहाँ से यहाँ तक चलने में ये विजडम हम लोग एक तरीके से प्राप्त कर सके. और हम बार बार ये महसूस करते हैं कि जितने ज़रूरी हिमालय के जंगल बचाने हैं उतने ही ज़रूरी वेस्टर्न घाट के जंगल बचाने हैं. और ग्लोबल कॉन्टेक्स्ट में पूरे साउथ एशिया के जंगल और पूरे अमेजन के जंगल बचाने जरूरी हैं. और उसके लिए क्या वैकल्पिक व्यवस्था हो सकती है ये देखने की बात है. और जब हम जंगल कहते हैं तो वो सिर्फ जंगल नहीं है, वो सिर्फ पेड़ नहीं है, वो पूरी बायोडाइवर्सिटी है जिसमें पूरी ग्लोबल फ्लोरा और फौना रिजाइड करते हैं. तो ये विजडम इन 40-50 सालों में हमारी जनरेशन को मिली. और उसमें बहुत बड़ा जो योगदान रहा वो इन आंदोलनों का रहा जिन्होंने हमें अल्टरनेटिव रास्ते, वैकल्पिक रास्ते सोचने के लिए और खोजने के लिए विवश किया.
Thank you. So, Ullas, if I can expand on that. One of the things I'm struck in your interventions over the last 25 years, you have been a cautious optimist. Even in 99, 2000, 2005, there was a lot of concern about the impending extinction of the tiger, mainly due to the tiger bone trade, also due to impacts on habitat. You held a somewhat different view. So is that also because you think India got something right when it comes to the question Shekhar raised, which is trying to protect biodiversity in its entirety? Now, obviously not in the whole landscape. It's a country with 1.3 billion people, about to overtake China sometime in the next few months. We're going to become the world's most populous nation. Now, whether that's something to celebrate or not, I'll leave it to you to judge. So, do you think India got something right? I mean, obviously, we may have got a lot of things wrong. So, what do you think we got right that 20, 25 years later? The picture, certainly, that you are painting of Malnad is very different from what it was 25 or 50 years ago.
I think the late 60s were a turning point in multiple ways. As far as pure wildlife protection and setting up of parks was concerned, there was a new chemistry operating. Mrs. Gandhi came to power and she was the only prime minister we ever had who had a genuine interest in wildlife protection. And luckily, she also proved to be a tough cookie, a dictator. So she was able to put in such strong laws, which people are still trying to dismantle, to protect wildlife. But she could get away with it because she was also a radical socialist populist who had mass following. So people didn't mind these radical laws because there are many other ways they feel they were benefiting. So there was this balance in operation that empowered our forestry service. Now, unlike all other colonial powers, the established forestry service of India was actually a state service. These were state officers recruited from the state. And in 1967, the Indian Forest Service didn't exist. It was a state department service, and the forestry was a state subject. And because of her political control, Mrs. Gandhi was able to make the chief minister do the right thing also. And the forestry department here, because of its history of a hierarchical structure, patrolling, command and control, which is fallen away now, at that point in time, it really worked. When the new laws came, people like Sankla, Mr. Shamsundar in this state, many of these officers were not from the old school of just timber alone. They had a new vision for forests, somewhat vague but clear vision of biodiversity. So Project Tiger came in, SP Shahi, these were all some of the real pioneer foresters. They played a role. And we should not underestimate the role of the non-government sector. It was not popular, it was not large number of people, but people like M. Krishnan, EPG, small number, you could even call them elites, but they had access to decision makers, both at the bureaucracy and at the level of political level. Today, all that access is gone. It's one massive bureaucracy which is impervious, almost, I can use the term knowledge proof, because no knowledge can come from outside. So these three chemistries triggered that response.
So I want to provoke you. No, when listening to Dr. Karanth, one of the things we all think about is how can society change for the better? And one of the great events of 19th century India was the abolition of sati. Raja Ram Mohan Roy picked up the issue of sati. He wrote extensively about it. And the word for sati, as Professor Tanika Sarkar has shown in Bangla, was the eater of fire, which actually is incorrect. Ram Mohan Roy changed it to wife murder. We have no writings from the women who participated in that big movement. And this happened because of Lord Bentinck. One of the great critics of Ram Mohan Roy was Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi wanted Indian tradition to be drawn upon and a critical transformation to come from within. And in some sense, all of us admire Bentinck, and of course we admire Ram Mohan Roy even more, but we also admire Gandhiji. So I'd like to ask you this transformation of consciousness on forest. How far has it come due to movements from below? And when these changes from above came, have they met their objective? तो किस हद तक आपको लग रहा है कि आप जिस तरह से और परिप्रेक्ष्य में देखते हैं उसमें फर्क होगा? क्योंकि आपका अनुभव तजुर्बा भी है.
If you look at the history of forest department, colonial forest department in India, you can found that many foresters were very keen to study ecological changes. They were concerned about especially climate change. In those days, 150 years back, some British officer was thinking about the climate change. It is unique. They were writing in the Indian Forester about the receding of the glaciers in early decades of last century. And many were meant for commercial felling, and they were committed colonialists. Every time they were keen that they should take every timber from Himalayas to different war fields to different parts of the world to their country. And the earnings which are coming from the forest produce, their site is also a stick on the forest as the resource. लेकिन लोग बहुत थे वन विभाग में भी और कॉलोनियल फॉरेस्ट में भी जो इकोलॉजी से कंसर्न रखते थे, और उनकी राइटिंग हमारे पास उपलब्ध है, और वन कैन सर्वे दैट लिटरेचर इन इंडियन फॉरेस्टर एंड एमंग अदर जर्नल्स आल्सो. जब हम आगे बढ़ते हैं, जैसे यू मे हैव सीन राम गुहाज बुक अनक्वाइट वुड्स, हाउ इन अर्ली decades of 20th century or in the last decade of 19th century, Kumaoni peasants started to protest when they realized that commercial forestry is all right in some parts, but the closure forests, which are very close to their villages or to their agricultural fields, their pasture lands, if the foresters or the forest department will encroach into that nearby territory, then we will be protesting. How Jungle Satyagraha started, not only in our part, but also in tribal belts and elsewhere in Indian subcontinent. And one can also look at the forestry history of Burma, also of Africa, Tanzania, also of Latin America. And communities were protesting against the colonial forest policy. But after independence, we were dreaming that our own government, or under who have much traditionally linked with Gandhi's tradition, so they will look at resources differently, different from the colonial point of view. and they will give more rights or responsibilities to community, and they will tackle forests while tackling with the wildlife, other flora, fauna, medicinal herbs, and many other aspects of the biodiversity or the forestry. But after independence, we were not able to do that. The diversity of laws or the understanding or the wisdom which should have we should have evolved in Indian subcontinental context, in that we failed. Even we were not able to change democratically or in a very creative way the Forest Act of 1927. Still we are waiting for another act, 90 years already passed. We have done only one positive thing in 1980 when Forest Conservation Act came. And Forest Conservation Act clearly say that no forest land will be used for non-forest purposes. And we are failed in sticking in that big important legislation. Many Indian states are not ready to opt for 2006 Forest and Tribal Act. तो अभी मुझे उम्मीद ये लगती है कि एक अच्छे लेजिस्लेशन के बावजूद भी जब तक पीपुल्स मूवमेंट का कंपल्सन नहीं होगा, तब तक किसी भी अच्छे सरकारी नियम की, कानून की इम्प्लीमेंटेबिलिटी जो है वो डाउटफुल है. इसलिए उनका जो जस्टिफिकेशन है, जो औचित्य है, वो बना हुआ है. पहाड़ों में इधर के सालों में जानवर बहुत घटे हैं, और मेरा एक दोस्त है वो राजस्थान में काम करता है. ही वाज आल्सो टेलिंग दैट जो टोटल नंबर ऑफ कैटल हैज कम डाउन. Even Tibetan studies, they say that their total number of domestic animals have come down in Tibet also. They have increased the wildlife. मैं देख रहा था कि the number of yaks in Tibet has grown up very rapidly because they need it for food. They need it for fuel also. In Tibet, cow dung जो है, that is used for fuel purposes. तो हमारे यहाँ जहाँ डेमोक्रेसी है, जहाँ बहुत सारे नियम कानून हैं, जहाँ हमारा संविधान कहता है इकोलॉजिकल सस्टेनेबिलिटी के बारे में या कंजर्वेशन के बारे में, वहाँ सिर्फ हमारे चुने हुए नेता उस काम को नहीं कर पा रहे हैं. आप अपने बेंगलोर को देखिए कि जहाँ जहाँ पर नेचुरल तालाब थे, हमारे पूर्वजों ने बनाए थे, हो सकता है कोई कंस्ट्रक्शनल पर्पज से बनाए हों, हमने उन सब पर घुसपैठ कर दी है. अब जब फ्लड आती है तो पूरे बेंगलोर में हाहाकार मच जाता है. पूरे वेस्टर्न घाट्स में हमने इतना बड़ा कंस्ट्रक्शन कर दिया है कि एक छोटी, वहाँ कोई भी नदी जो है 100 किलोमीटर 125 किलोमीटर से लंबी नहीं है केरला में, लेकिन सडनली जब फ्लड आता है तो आपने देखा होगा था इन 2019 द टोटल टॉल वाज मोर देन 500 people they died in Kerala flood, or in a year the flood repeated. Just look at 1919 and 20. You look at the ecological map of India, then you see in every season we have floods. We have twice floods in Bihar. We have floods in Gujarat, Rajasthan. We have floods in Nepal too or Pakistan too. तो ये जो चेंज जो हम देखते थे कि एक बड़ा हैबक जो है, इट विल कम और इट विल रिपीट इटसेल्फ आफ्टर 10 years और a decade or 2 decades, वो दे हैव बिकम एनुअल फीचर. तो ये मेरे मन में आता है, लेकिन बहुत सारी चीज़ें मन में नहीं आती हैं जो बहुत सारे लोगों के बीच में संवाद होगा. तो आई होप कि न्यू थिंग्स विल कम एंड आवर एनालिटिकल एबिलिटी विल इंक्रीज और इट विल बिकेम मोर ह्यूमन और मोर डेमोक्रेटिक और मोर जिसको कहेंगे कि प्रोन टू एक्शन.
So since Shekhar referred to popular consciousness, voluntary movements, I'm struck looking at the newspapers, having worked in one for some time, by the amount of coverage that is there on human-animal conflict and where very specific stances are taken. You know, last few days there's been a leopard near Banerghatta which had killed a deer. In Mysuru today we have heard DFO has given orders to shoot a particular leopard. Since you are also a student for a very long time of mammal ecology, mammal behavior, do you think we ought to have some sense of perspective when we look at these very tragic events? You know, the killing of that leopard, if it were to happen, would be tragic. The killing of a human being or of a valuable goat or cow is also very important tragedy. And I'm sure we all recognize that both are tragedies. But as someone who's studied it from the biological point of view, but also been involved a lot in conservation, what is the sense of perspective you think we ought to bring to these conflicts? I'm not only referring to tigers, but the larger sort of dilemma.
First of all, the biggest killer of human beings in India is the elephant, not the tiger. 500 people die from elephant attacks. There is the psychology about big cats which kind of blows it out of proportion. If we look at the overall scale of conflict, it is least in parts where the wildlife has been wiped out, like Nagaland, great parts of Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand. There is least conflict because only the trees are there. The wildlife has been wiped out and there is no conflict or very little conflict. Where we have conflict is where actually the wildlife numbers have come back, number one, in these protected areas and around them. The other is the anti-hunting laws that came in the 70s where there was an effective governance system of stopping poachers or arresting people. There was stigma attached to it, there was a cost attached to it. Where such laws have been operative, like in most of the Western Ghats, parts of central India, parts of maybe Uttarakhand, parts of Assam, you see a resurgence of wildlife, and there is a natural consequence of that. You do get animals that are, so to speak, surplus in a very small fraction of the land. Now, these are not common incidents. So there are other species which have come back in agricultural landscape, like sloth bears and leopards, again because hunting has, not in Jharkhand, not in Chhattisgarh. Please remember, all this is where the wildlife has been protected. So once you have a problem on hand, whoever is managing the situation has a real dilemma on hand, because there is a large constituency of urban animal lovers, wildlife lovers who are not affected by the conflict, and they are dead opposed to killing any problem animal. And they want this animal to be captured and released somewhere safely, where it is safe and people are safe. There is no such place. And capturing an animal, I was the first person to capture and radio collar tigers in India, is not easy. Even if it's a hoofed animal, those who are among the vets will know how difficult it is to tranquilize and capture animals live. And this excessive focus on individual animals' life, the consequence of it is we have serial depredations by tigers. A few individual, normally they're afraid of people. You may have leopards living, like these 4 leopards have been living there forever. Just because somebody got it in a camera, everybody is screaming. But normally, once you have a predatory behavior established, they start viewing humans as prey for various reasons. It's too detailed to go in here. That animal has to be swiftly eliminated by the quickest means. To save the species, to save the park and get public support, we have to eliminate problem animals. Unfortunately, our officers, our bureaucracy doesn't tell this very plainly to the politicians. And our judges make nonsensical judgments, pompous judgments, which say, you make love to that tiger that's eating people. So there is a dichotomy, and in the end, the park protection suffers because people turn hostile to the park. Forest Department's job becomes difficult. So we have to very clearly separate survival of the species from survival of the individuals. I think this, if we take this step and swiftly eliminate the problem animals, much of this angst against wildlife and conflict will go away.
Indira Gandhi luckily was a dictator, a surprising statement in the Bangalore Lit Fest. But it's been very interesting listening to both of you because Mr. Karanth, you're talking about individual interventions and Shekhar ji is talking about community interventions. But you're both looking back at 40, 50 years ago. Do you feel that either the individual approach or Shekhar ji, in your context, the community approach, when a lot of social movements are being criminalized currently, how do you see these two approaches working?
I'm really sorry, that will be the only question because we're out of time. And I apologize for the gender imbalance in the panel. And ma'am, that's a very important question. I'll request Dr. Karanth, and then Shekhar will have the proverbial last one.
Yeah, I will quickly touch on. See, when you speak for 2 minutes to capture something, when I said dictator, in the sense she is a prime minister who made the chief ministers listen to her. And the wildlife was under the chief minister's mandate. They listened to her. The second point is, in the planning allotment, states that declared protected areas lost 60% of their revenue, and she made good of that. But all this is a long story, but it was strong leadership politically for wildlife, which has never existed before her, never existed after her.
Actually, in a minor point as a historian, there are many things about Mrs. Gandhi which have and should be questioned. I'm sure this also is open to question. But this part of her legacy has survived, though many of the leaderships have come from very different political traditions. Shekhar.
जो उल्लास जी ने कहा मैं उसमें इतना ही जोड़ना चाहता हूँ. Apart from acts and regulations, we need two other things. And I believe on the power of these two aspects. Number one, the social consciousness, social awareness, social thinking about the care of the wild animals. Many people are very concerned about domestic animals, pets. They are not much concerned about the wildlife, which lives in the forest. So they don't think about the encroachment into the forest. The second aspect is much more important. Nature also has the power or ability to conserve itself, so its parts. If forest can conserve itself, while conserving itself, it is also conserving the flora and fauna inside the forest. I'm giving you one evidence. When there was census of tigers in Jim Corbett Park, they went outside of the Jim Corbett National Park. They found in the large territory east of Jim Corbett Park, the total number of tigers has increased dramatically. So many people thought that they may have come out from the park. Then the park officers told, no, we have already their census, and we know total number of tigers inside the national park. But outside of national park, the total number of tigers increased. And one very good forest officer told me that we know that this forest has given the life of these tigers, which are not VIP tigers. उसके लिए उन्होंने एक शब्द का इस्तेमाल किया, below poverty line tigers, लेकिन they are still surviving there. So I also believe on the power of the nature. And if we don't encroach into the nature, into the forest will give life to all who are there, residing there since millenniums, since very long.
So thank you all very much, and I want to thank both the distinguished panelists.